So our after-dinner speaker tonight is Mike Starbird, and some of you know him, probably many of you know of him. I've known Mike for a really long time, and so I find it kind of hard to figure out how to introduce him because there's so very much to say. So I guess I should start by telling you that he got his undergraduate degree at Pomona College and his PhD in topology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a student of Mary Ellen Rudin, who was herself a student of the great R.L. Moore, whose legacy we honor at this conference. Just this past spring, Pomona acknowledged Mike's work and teaching with an honorary doctorate. Mike joined the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin in 1974, where he has been a transformative teacher for generations of students, including myself. Mike is now a member of the UT's Academy of Distinguished Teachers. And then there is, an incredibly long list of awards, including the MAA's HIMO Award for Distinguished Teaching. The list of teaching awards that he's received from the University of Texas is so long and so varied that I am pretty sure they made up some awards along the way so they could just give him another one. But the accolades don't stop there. His wonderful book, The Heart of Mathematics, An Invitation to Effective Thinking, written with Ed Berger, was a runner-up for the university's Robert W. Hamilton Award for Best Book Written by UT Faculty. And here's the big one. In 1989, Mike was UT's Recreational Sports Super Rackets champion. Mike has co-authored a number of other books, including Number Theory Through Inquiry and Distilling Ideas, An Introduction to Mathematical Thinking. These are two textbooks published by the MAA that support an inquiry-based approach. I understand that we can also look forward to a forthcoming undergraduate topology textbook that he's writing along with Francis Su. So I'm excited about that. And I'll skip over a few other books and his extremely popular teaching company courses, though if you nab me later, I will tell you about being chased down the National Mall in Washington by a park ranger who was a fan. It was like hanging out with a rock star. I want to return to The Heart of Mathematics and the more recent Starbird-Berger book, The 5 Elements of Effective Thinking. These books, and Mike Starbird himself, remind us that what we do as mathematics educators is profound and important. Learning mathematics is a vehicle for learning to think effectively. At its best, it can show us that being intellectually playful in everything we do is not only a wonderful way to live our lives, it is a doorway to seeing things in new and productive ways. It is exactly what we need to confront and solve difficult problems of all types. And with this, Mike acts as the conscience of our community. He makes us realize that we have a tremendous responsibility not to screw up. But he encourages us to think of it as a wonderful opportunity to transform the lives of students who come through our doors, not just the math majors, but everyone. I'm honored to introduce Michael Starbird.
Well, thank you very much, Carol. That was a very sweet introduction. I really appreciate it. It was very kind. I'm delighted to be here to talk about the title of my talk is Right Time, Right Place. And the reason for that title is because I'm going to make an argument. I'll tell you the end of the argument right now, and then we'll see if I can accomplish it during the hour or two. Which is to argue that the inquiry-based learning project is poised to take off in the national and international arena because of various influences that are occurring. One of them is the onslaught of online education. Such things as MOOCs. MOOCs, for those of you who are not familiar with the jargon, a MOOC is a massive open online course, M-O-O-C. And MOOCs, I think MOOCs are really an example of something that has a lot of potential, and we should really be thinking about how to develop these and explore them and experiment with them. And there's something magic about the possibility that a kid in Bangladesh can look on his or her cell phone and see some of the great educational ideas of the world and become part of an international economy and productive society. So to me, that image is so powerful that it is absolutely worth exploring. However, the reason that many universities are pursuing these kinds of developments are not quite so grand. They're more in terms of saving money for teaching and teaching vast numbers of people at one time. So I think there is one extremely important outcome of this large experiment with MOOCs. And that is that it forces every institution to ponder the following question. What value are we adding to our students' lives by having them actually in the room with us? Teachers have to ask that. I think it's a great question and a legitimate question. If we can't answer that question, if we have to say, geez, I don't know, I could just have the students watch a videotaped lecture, maybe by a lecturer who's better than I am. If that is the answer, then that's not a very compelling reason for us being in the classroom with our students. But as I say, we're in the right place at the right time, because the correct answer is more active engagement, such as inquiry-based learning strategies. Because that's a very difficult thing to duplicate online, but something that can be extremely important and transformative in the actual classroom. But to me, the question that this whole issue begs is to ask ourselves, can we be specific about what it is that we're offering by having students in our room, in the classroom during the hours that they're there? And so that's the question that we will explore during this time. But I thought that I would start by saying that I am one of the people who actually has experimented with a MOOC. So I did a MOOC this last spring. I produced a MOOC, and there were 58,000 students who at least checked the beginning of the thing. That doesn't mean they watched any of it, but they had some interaction with it, 58,000 of them. And a few thousand actually did a significant amount of this MOOC. But what I was interested in experimenting with was to see whether or not some aspects of inquiry kind of education could be put into this MOOC environment. The online environment is about as foreign and resistant to this kind of teaching as you can imagine. And so I thought, well, here's a challenge for me. What can I do to make this, to make inquiry-based learning available online? Well, experiments are meant to fail, and this one certainly did in many ways, but that doesn't mean it was a bad experiment. It's a good experiment, and I learned a lot of things from the experiment. And so the first thing let me tell you what I did. I didn't want to just lecture. So instead what I did is I sat down with one or more students, and I would pose a mathematical question to the student or students, and then I would let them work on it. And they would think about it, and I'd ask them to talk as they thought so that we could hear what they were thinking. And then I would, from time to time, give some advice about how to think more effectively. And this was the style of the MOOC. So it was quite different from a standard lecture format MOOC. And let me just say, well, have you seen Mission Impossible, the movies? Yeah. This was not quite that exciting. You know, the thrills didn't come quite so fast, you know. But I think it was thrilling in a different way, namely seeing the students studying is actually, I think, one of the real thrills of education. When you see a person actually grappling with ideas and actually changing their own minds through their thinking. So I think the real thrills were there, but maybe they didn't translate so well into the medium of TV. But I was curious whether you would like to see a few minutes of a MOOC. Would you like to see a few minutes of my MOOC? Okay, let me set this up for you by posing the puzzle that I posed to this student. And I had posed the puzzle, and then you'll see him working on it. So I'll pose the question to you and let you think about it first. This is a puzzle from our Heart of Math book. And so here it is. It's called the Meanie Genie. So the puzzle goes like this: that a person is in some place, and a genie comes out of a bottle, and the person says, "Well, I'm looking for a famous jewel, the Ramanujan, and I'd like to find the jewel." And so the genie says, "Okay." He says, "You have 3 wishes, and you want to find it." And so he says, "Fine." And he says, and then nine blocks occur before the person, and the genie says, "Okay, now your job is to find it." And the person says, "Well, wait a minute, how can I find it?" And they say, "Well, the jewel, which by the way is called the Ramanujan, you think, is slightly heavier than the other stones, and therefore it's slightly heavier. This one is slightly heavier than the other 8, which are all identical." And the person said, "Well, how can I find it?" And they said, "Geez, I wish I had a balance scale." And so the genie said, "Oh, that's your second wish. You have a balance scale, you see. And the balance scale can only be used once," the genie explains. And then the person said, "Geez, I wish I had another one." And they said, "Okay, there you go. You got 2 of them. You can use each one once. And you can, the goal is to try to find the Ramanujan, you see." Now, so I'll let you think about this for a minute. So did you understand the question? By the way, you may wonder, why did I say such a long question instead of just saying you have 9 things, 8 of them the same way? The reason is that one of the things that I think I like to try to teach my students is that much of issues in trying to come to a resolution of problems is to ignore superfluous information. So no, really. So I intentionally made it this complicated thing to say, what is the actual question here? And then people have to figure that out and ignore all the rest of the stuff. Well, you all do that automatically, so that doesn't seem too interesting to you, but that's an important thing. In any case, so go ahead, spend just 1 minute and figure out how to do this. You've got 2 weighings of the balance scale, and your goal is to find the one stone that you know is heavier, the one block that you know is heavier. Go ahead, talk it over. Okay, so how are you doing? You all right? Okay, so this is, let me now show you what happened when I gave this, I explained the puzzle, and now here you'll see, here you will now see the student working on this puzzle. So here we go, and it's thrilling.
We can't weigh all of them at one time. That would make very little sense, because, well, we have an odd number of stones. So simple enough, you put 4 on one, 5 on the other, obviously one's going to weigh more. So you don't learn anything from that.
Right.
I'm guessing that these aren't going to be super precise scales in any way. They don't tell you the degree of variance. They only tell you how much.
That's correct.
That one is heavier than the other.
That's right. One just goes like if one side is heavier.
Okay. My first thought is to weigh 4 and 4 and have one that's just on the side.
All right. Okay.
So that will be our first weigh-in.
Okay.
If we weigh the 4 against each other, and they come out equal, then we're actually done. We would actually know that one that I didn't weigh was the Ramanujan. That's not very likely, though. That's a 1 in 9 chance that I actually managed to weigh it proper, or pick the right one in the first case.
Okay.
So what's likely to happen is one set of 4 stones contains the Ramanujan, which means that it would be slightly heavier than the other 4.
Yeah.
So that means that I can actually eliminate those 4 from knowing, we know that the Ramanujan's not there.
Yeah.
And I still have a 5th stone. So that's a problem. Now, if I were to take that same 4, split that up, and do the same thing that I did the first time, so I would weigh 2 versus 2.
Okay.
I still have this 1 extra that I don't know what to do with yet. If either one of those, see, I'd need 3. Well, let me follow through with that thought. So I'd weigh the 2, so the 2 stones that are remaining from the first weigh-in, or the 4, I'm sorry. The 4 stones that are remaining from the first weigh-in.
And by remaining, what do you mean?
By remaining, we mean we determined that of those 4, the Ramanujan is in one of those.
I see. Yes, that's
Yes.
correct. That's what you learned.
Yes. So now I have 4 stones. Oh, hey, I can also eliminate that stone too. So I'm happy about that.
Okay.
So now I only have 4 stones to work with. But if I do a weigh-in of these 2, or 2 on each, if I do a weigh-in of the remaining 4, one of them is going to be heavier than the other, which will eliminate 2 more, which leaves me 2 stones. And that's a problem, because I can only take 1 stone. So that's my first approach.
Okay. Great.
So you get a flavor for it. You know, so it was really rather fun. What happened with this one, by the way, is that he tried this 4 against 4 for a while. It didn't seem to work. Then he tried 3 against 3 for just a minute, but he really didn't think it was a good idea, because then there'd be 3 left over. And these leftover ones, he always thought, and he said, well, then there are even more left over. Instead of just 1 left over, the 3 of them, that's not going to work. And so he returned to the 4 against 4 for a very long time. And so this took quite a while. I don't know how long, maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour. We worked on this problem, and then he finally resolved it. And one of the things that he learned was one of the things that he had failed to do when he considered the 3 against 3 the first time was that he didn't actually explore it thoroughly. He just looked at it and said, oh, that's not going to work, and then went back and returned to the 4 against 4. To me, this is something of a metaphor for what many of us do in much of our lives, which is that we have a proposed solution to something, we think it's a great idea, and we will continue to pursue that until the end, rather than actually abandoning some strategies that don't work too well and moving on to other methods. There was my mentor, R.H. Bing, was a famous topologist, and he was the reason I came to the University of Texas to work with R.H. Bing. And one of the things that he did, which was so distinctive and incredibly potent, was that when he was working on one of these unsolved problems, what he would do is not presume to know what the answer was. He would work for 2 hours trying to prove that the thing was true, the conjecture was true, and then he would work for 2 hours trying to prove the conjecture was false. And then return and spend 2 hours trying to prove it was true, and 2 hours proving it was false. And the idea was that no matter what the actual reality was, first of all, he would say, I don't care what the reality is, it's just my job to find it. But the second thing is that you learn things from exploring the opposite side of a question. You learn as much even when you're trying to produce a counterexample for a true theorem as you do when you're trying to prove a true theorem, often. So that's one of the strategies, is to forcing yourself to be open-minded by considering both sides of a question. And this was an example of something, and we would discuss this. At the end of this exploration of this little puzzle, one of the things that we would discuss is the strategy. And I would have him actually talk about his own thinking strategy, what he did, what he might have done that was more effective. And so the goal was to have these students have the experience of thinking for themselves and then reflecting on that thinking. So that was an interesting. Did you find that interesting at all or not? I can't. It's hard to tell. Okay. So anyway, it was sort of interesting, and if you want more of that, we taped 53 hours of this stuff, of which we showed 17 on the MOOC. Was after it was cut into little pieces, but in thinking of the right time and the right place, it really brings to mind several issues about what is the right time. What's the right time and the right place for education of getting people to learn to think better? To me, the whole goal of education, I said it to those of you who were in the session this morning, to me the goal of education is to transform lives and to make our students become different people in the lives that they actually live after they leave college and after they leave the university, after they leave formal education. That is the whole goal of what we have. You have to constantly ask yourself, what do I want, how do I want my students to be different and better after 15 years because of the experience they had in my course? That is the basic question, and it's the daunting question for any educator. And the goal, and the way to think about it is, well, what exactly do you expect people to try to come away with? What kind of skills, attitudes, and habits do you want them to have that they didn't have when they came into our classes? There's a time to teach that, and I think that one question is, when in the educational experience should they start, they being the students, start having these experiences of education where they're asked to think for themselves? In my case, I had a very privileged upbringing. My parents were teachers. My mother and my father, they both taught in East Los Angeles, which is a barrio in East Los Angeles. My mother taught remedial reading in the junior high school level. And my father taught at what was then called a junior college, East Los Angeles Junior College, or community college now. And, but it was a privileged upbringing because every night at home when we would have dinner, my parents would bring up questions. In the case of my father, who taught mathematics and physics and astronomy, he often brought mathematical puzzles to the dinner table. And then he would ask us these puzzles and we'd work on them, and that was what you did at dinner, you know. Or he would have read an article in Scientific American. I remember one of them. He said he had read an article about whether dolphins can learn language. And they'd done some experiments with a dolphin hitting its nose against some things, you know. And he would explain the article and say, what do you all think about that? You know, do you think the dolphins learn a language, and do you think this experiment explained it? And then we would all discuss it, all being my brother and I and my mother. My brother also has a PhD in mathematics. It was just sort of the natural thing to do. And I thought that the time to learn to think was at the dinner table. And it really rather shocked me when I learned later in life, when I started having dinner with other people, that this wasn't the normal conversation. At the dinner, I thought you always did this at the dinner table. That was the time, and that was the place to really begin to learn how to think. So I think, as a matter of fact, in the educational system, the answer to the question of when is all the time. I think the question of when to have students learning to think and consciously creating an environment and an experiences for those students where they are forced to take on the habits of an independent thinker. I think that's what we need to create for them throughout their educational system. So the place is every classroom that we teach in, and the time is every time that we're in the class with students. So the inquiry-based learning tries to organize the experience so that people have a higher probability of having to think for themselves and become accustomed to that as the norm of their life. And to me, that is the beauty of this style of thinking. It's forcing us to think about what the long-term goal is and what experiences we can give our students to lead them to that goal. One of the things that we want to teach people is to become independent thinkers. And I have a story I want to tell you about my own case where I learned one of these lessons about independent thinking. I was in a class when I was a senior in college at Pomona College. I was a senior in a class that was a medieval art history class. And this class was taught by an extremely scholarly and extremely old professor. She was extremely old. In fact, we all thought that she knew so much about Gothic cathedrals because she was there when they were built. That was our hypothesis. Well, one day, this mobile fossil said the dreaded words. She would show pictures, these Byzantine pictures, and she said the dreaded words, Mr. Starbird, what do you see in this picture? Well, this picture, as you may remember from your art history days, the pictures are weird. I don't know what they were looking at when they painted them, but their hands were way too long. Do you remember these things? The heads are too short. They've got a big halo across the top. Do you remember these pictures? Yeah? Okay. So she showed one of these pictures and said to me, what do you see in this picture? Well, of course, I always sat in the back row because you weren't allowed to sit in the hall. So I was in the back row, and she said this. Now, I was a math major, and obviously nothing came to my mind, right? It was art. But I had been to art history classes, and I knew that art has meaning. So I said, I think the arc, the halo, represents the arc of humanity from the primordial void up to the shining glory of heaven and into the infinity of the abyss. I know. It was ripe. She said, cut out the bowl and tell me what you see. And that was an important lesson that I learned in college, which was to not, instead of trying to guess what you think the other person wants to hear, or instead of guessing the strategy you think somebody else is thinking, what do you personally think? Can you personally understand what it is you know? And to me, one of the features about inquiry-based learning experiences is that it forces us to be honest. If we're giving a lecture before a class, it is so easy to see all those nodding heads and to live under the illusion that those nods mean they understand things and are grasping them and following you and loving every minute of it, you see? In IBL classes, when students are at the board, you know that they're saying what they personally know. And it brings that kind of honesty to the experience that I think is extremely beneficial. So actually saying what you know is an important thing, and I think that that's something that IBL teaches us. And if you think about the people in the IBL community, like R.L. Moore himself and others, it's this independence of thinking that really leads to the kinds of successes that people can have. If you're really trying to solve a question that has not been solved before, maybe such as education, maybe it requires us to actually think independently about it. And what really happens? What actually works? And I think we in the IBL community have a long way to go. And I think we've gone a long way in the last 15 years in seeing that there are there's a whole diversity of different methods that are used by people in this room and in our IBL community. And I think that's great. And we need to explore what features actually work and don't work. This is one of the great explorations that we have lying before us. So to me, this is an example of being in the right place at the right time. Well, I like to think about what exactly we're trying to teach people. What are the methods of thinking that make people successful in being able to solve challenging problems? And one of them, I think, is to actually understand simple things deeply. And this is a theme that many of us in the mathematical community embrace in a regular way. And I think that if we turn our minds toward even the most basic things in mathematics, we always see an added richness. And we know that we have this experience when we have the idea of simple numbers, and then we learn more about it, and all of number theory comes before us. Or we see a concept of a group, and then we see all these numbers are examples of things. It shows additional richness when we revisit fundamentals. Thinking about calculus, we in this room, we understand what the meaning of the derivative and the integral are. Many of our students don't. And returning to those basics and understanding what the basics really mean, I think is an extremely powerful strategy that can be taught as a method of teaching, of operating in the world. And I have a great story. I know some of you have heard it before, but it's my favorite story, and I always tell it, and I love it, a story, which is about the trumpet lesson. So a few years ago, a friend of mine, whose name is Tony Plogue, was and is an international trumpet virtuoso. He's one of the best trumpet players in the world. And he was invited to come to the University of Texas to debut some of his compositions. He's also a composer. And he was invited to come down. By the way, University of Texas has a great music school. And so he came down. He lives in Germany. And they brought him over, and he stayed at my house. And while he was there, they debuted his pieces, and then the next day, they had him give a master class in trumpet. And I told him, you know, he's staying at my house, I said, geez, I've never been to a master class. I don't even know what a master class is. Could I come along? And he said, sure, come along. How many of you know what a master class is? You know what a master class is? So a lot of you know what a master class is. Okay. Okay, so it's a music thing, but it's great. But I'll explain what it was. So I went into this with him to the master class, and what it was is in the music school they had a little room. It wasn't a big room, but it had a piano in it, and it had about an audience of about 20 people who were trumpet students and trumpet faculty. So these were students who were going to make their professions in playing the trumpet and faculty members of the trumpet. And they introduced Tony, and he was, you know, one of the best trumpet players in the world, so they were really impressed. You know, they said, this is Tony Plogue. They all knew him, and they thought, oh, this is really cool. You know, Tony Plogue's here. It was like if, you know, Roger Federer came to give a lesson in tennis. You know, really, really cool. Roger Federer, by the way, is a tennis player. You know, you never know what your audience knows, you know. In any case, so he was introduced, and the way the lesson proceeded is that he asked somebody from the audience to come down. And so I forgot the guy's name, but maybe Bob. So it says, who's our first performer? It was Bob. Bob comes down, and my friend Tony says, well, what are you going to play for us today? And Bob says, well, I'm going to play the third movement of the Rachmaninoff, something, you know, some fancy thing, and proceeds to play this virtuosic kind of music. You know, really great stuff, you know, about 3 or 4 minutes. And then Tony said, oh, thank you very much. That was very good, very good. Let me give you some advice about this. And he proceeds to give him some advice, as you'd expect. He said, oh, if you hold the trumpet this way, if you purse your lips this way, if you think about this musical phrase in a different way, and you explode, you know, all the kinds of advice that you'd expect the professional to give to this wonderful student. And by the way, the student is great. The student is a PhD student in trumpet performance. He's going to make his living playing the trumpet. He's really an excellent, excellent player. But, you know, not the international virtuoso. So Tony said at the end of this interaction, he said, how much time do you spend practicing the exercises? Apparently, trumpet players all play the same exercises. And it was basically like scales, you know, and so Hanon and music and so on. So he says, the guy said, Bob says, well, I warm up for 5 minutes, and then I go ahead and practice my pieces. And my friend Tony said, well, you might spend more time on the exercises. Bob says, okay, you know, I didn't make a big deal of it. He just said, you know, and Bob said, okay, I'll do it, and sits down. That's the end of him. And the next player comes up. Who's next? Ann. So Ann comes up, same thing happens. He plays virtuosic stuff, he gives pointers, they interact for a while, and then at the end of it he says, Ann, how much time do you spend practicing the exercises? And she said, I warm up for 5 minutes and then I practice. And by the way, these people practice several hours a day. You know, these are serious musicians. And he said, oh, you might spend more time on the exercises. The same thing happens with all 4 of the people who were treated in this fashion. And at the end of it, then it was about a 2-hour deal, by the way, 2-hour thing. And at the end of these 2 hours, he's finished, all 4 people sit down, and he says, are there any questions? Well, I always have questions. You know, I'm the only one in the room who knows nothing about the trumpet, but I always have questions, so I raise my hand. He looks at me, you know, he's thinking, why did I bring this guy along, you know? He said, yes, Mike, what is your question? And I said, well, why did you keep telling these people, you told every one of them, to practice their exercises more? Didn't you hear them? They're great. Why did you tell them to practice their exercise more? And he said, well, let me show you. And he said, Bob, would you come back down? So this is Bob, the first guy, comes back down. Bob comes back down, and my friend Tony says, would you please play this exercise for us? And Bob says, sure, I'll play it, and proceeds to play the exercise everybody knows. Ba-da-da-da-da. Some very childish thing. We have only heard virtuosic music up to this point. This was a childish thing, da-da-da-da-da, like that. And Tony nods and says, uh-huh, mm-hmm. And then he says, could I borrow your trumpet? I'm thinking to myself, Tony, you're giving a trumpet lesson, bring a trumpet. You know, that's what, bring a trumpet, that's the least you can do. Bring a trumpet. Apparently didn't think of that, did not think of that. So he borrows the trumpet. He does have his own mouthpiece, however, for those of you who believe in germs. He put the mouthpiece in and proceeded to play this exercise. But when he plays it, it is gorgeous. Every note rings like a bell. The phrasing sounds beautiful. It's just music. You could just sit there and listen to that exercise all day long. Every note sounded wonderful. It was completely clear after hearing that difference, that the difference between this wonderful student and the actual virtuoso took place at the level of the most fundamental basics. Tony had not played anything before, so he didn't play any of the virtuosic things. But he explained it right then. He said, look, if you want to know how to play these virtuosic passages with more control and more precision and more beauty, the way to do it is to master these fundamentals with such power, such efficiency, you learn, and with such control, that when you do the most advanced work there is, you will do it far better than you ever could have done before. Now, let me be clear, it doesn't mean that the strategy is to just work on fundamentals and never move forward, because you could never learn to play those fundamentals at that level if you didn't proceed forward and try to learn more advanced work and then return to the fundamentals and see them in a different light. The new light you see the fundamentals are informing the most advanced work that you're doing. And so going back to the fundamentals and then forward, back and forward, to me this is the moral of the story. And when we're teaching our mathematics classes, going back to the fundamentals, asking students to review and to honestly say what it is that they really know about things that they should have learned before as they're proceeding to the more advanced work is something that will automatically help them with the advanced work. It's like the magical thing in mathematics. I mean, I know you all know this and have experienced it. When you learn something new, suddenly things that you had learned previously fit together better. And all of a sudden they make much more sense than they did before, even if what you learn that's new may have little relation to what you started with. Have you had that experience? It's sort of common. Okay, so that's an example of understanding simple things deeply. Now to me, so the question is, once again, talking about the right time and the right place. One thing about time is how much time it takes students to actually master ideas, whether it's the fundamentals or the more advanced ones. How much time does it take? I think that this is an example of something, you saw on the video, this student looking at these two, working through this little puzzle. It takes time. It takes time for them to get it straight. And one thing, and it's shocking for me to confess, that one of the things I learned in doing this MOOC was the amount of time it took for students to actually grapple with these ideas. In my ordinary classroom teaching, what really happens is students go off by themselves at home, and then they come back in class, and there's a whole group of them, and I ask some sort of a question, and they're presenting it or working on it, but they're also talking to each other, and they're getting help, and they've thought about it in advance. And some of the actual meandering way to get from where they start to where you want them to end up is hidden in that process. So to me, one of the eye-opening features of this experiment with the MOOC was that I was sitting with individuals, and they were just struggling through these ideas, and they would very often look like they almost had it and then lose it and move away and then come back and finally get it. But what is so heartening about that meandering way is that as they're going on false passages, they are learning ways that don't work. And that's positive knowledge. When they're learning something that doesn't work, that is a positive piece of knowledge about the mathematics. They have taken advantage of the mistakes that they made and seen it as fitting in and filling out the reality of the subject that they're studying, so that they have a robust understanding when they complete that journey, not only of what is exactly right, a thin thread of correctness, but in also the surrounding territory that gives it a very firm foundation. So one thing that I think is great about inquiry-based learning classes is that when you have a student who has figured something out on his or her own, and you ask them a question at the board that's related to it but not quite exactly that question, they're very often able to cope with it. They can do it because they know more than just the thin line of what they're doing. Is it time for me to stop? Is that what you're saying? Okay. So in any case, another thing about the right time and the right place is, how about giving people that time to explore, that time to really, enjoy the process, the wonder, the curiosity, and the fun of exploration. And when I think back about the most joyful times in my own topology class, for example, where I was introduced to this R.L. Moore method, it was the times when I just struggled with an idea, and it was just great fun. I would struggle with it and see it, and then when I really got it, it was such a wonderfully satisfying moment. So that was a time. So I'd like to just end by saying that I think that, once again, IBL is at an amazingly interesting moment in its own history. Lots of research about human learning is suggesting that the kind of struggle that we incorporate intentionally into the experience of students is exactly what's needed for students to come to an actual understanding of ideas. And with this incursion of online courses and MOOCs and all of the technology that's surrounding us, and in some ways a diversion from what the core mission is, it's the right time for IBL to make its presence really potent as bringing us back to the fundamentals of what it is that education is about. Helping students to learn to think for themselves. So I hope that you also find the time of these next 2 days here at this conference, particularly those of you who are new to IBL, to take advantage of the place and the people around you who have had experience, and really get the most out of this time and place as you can. So thank you very much.
I'm always very inspired by hearing Mike Starbird talk. I think we have some time for questions. There are some microphones up in the middle, so if you would like to ask a question, please proceed to a microphone, and before you ask your question, please introduce yourself and give your name, and then if we can even get some lines, we can get in more questions. So I will turn it over to Professor Starbird.
I'm Sarah Marie Belcastro, and here's my question. When you were designing the videos you did with the MOOC, why did you choose to have one student instead of, say, 2 or 3 talking to each other?
Oh, I often had 2 or 3.
Okay.
This happened to be, what I really did is it would depend on who was around. Usually I had 2. It was the normal number. This one happened to be 1. But so the answer is I would have preferred to have more, and it was just for practical reasons. He happened to be there that day. So it was a real seat of the pants operation, by the way. You may get this. I mean, we literally bought a camera in my office. I now have a camera and a tripod and lights and stuff, and we took some of these at my house, and some of them in my office and stuff. So it was a very experimental journey.
Hi, I'm Betty Love from Omaha, Nebraska, and my question is a very broad one, but I mean, I totally agree with everything that you've said here, but I wonder if you could speak to the, what can be done, or is it even possible that the changes that you're talking about can actually occur in our public school system so that, kids are learning to think as opposed to memorizing things for a test or, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, and the answer is yes, this kind of change, not only can it happen, it is happening. I think it is happening by witnessing the people who are in this room right now. There's a lot of interest in this kind of education, and a lot more to be learned, frankly, about human learning and what the most potent interventions are. So I am very optimistic. I'm optimistic by nature, but also by the reality of the numbers of people who are being influenced to try different techniques. More materials are being developed, more opportunities for students for teachers to learn how to use this method. And as the community grows, it's an exponential kind of phenomenon, that the people who know it are talking to their colleagues in their departments, in their own schools, and that has a exponential growth kind of effect. So I'm optimistic. And by the way, it's not to say that there's one right way. This is a spectrum. And if we get more thinking instruction at all levels, that's great, but it's going to be a quilt.
Annie Selden, New Mexico State. I thought you were going to say something else. I thought you were going to tell us the lessons you learned from doing this MOOC, and I'd like to hear some of the lessons you learned from trying to do this MOOC this way.
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, you may be saying, okay, what lessons did I learn in terms of doing a MOOC? What kind of MOOCs are valuable? And I'd say I didn't necessarily learn a lot of lessons there, because what I learned about was things about how the journeys that students take to actually learn something. So the lessons I learned had to do with lessons that can be applied in my actual classes, which have to do with patience, have to do with acknowledgement of the difficulties, of the requirement to reinforce and help people to understand fundamentals such as what the question is. Very often I'd pose a question and then we'd talk for a while and then we'd have to do the question again and again and again, because they would sort of lose the thread of what the question was. So it was more, the lessons that I learned more had to do with things I should have known for many years about how it is that, how circuitous and roundabout the way is for human beings to learn. And so I would say the lesson for instruction has to do with to acknowledge the difficulty that students have in learning. I mean, we're asking them to do something that's very difficult in thinking in the kind of clear way that we value as mathematics educators. And I think, by the way, the real value of that comes in applying that kind of clarity to worlds outside of mathematics. To me, that is where the main value of what we do happens, because most people aren't going to use the mathematics per se in their everyday life. So when you are focusing on teaching them to think better and have those experiences, I think that's where the real value occurs. Now, you could ask the question, what kind of MOOCs would be valuable? And I think that the answer to that is, I could imagine all kinds of things, like little modules that would be useful for instructing people. I think, when I think about the MOOCs myself, by the way, if I think of like the future of my MOOC, I could imagine having a person who's in an institution where they don't really have the opportunity to develop intriguing classes. They may be teaching a lot of classes, they may not have the time, they may not have the background, but they could take advantage of expertise from outside and have it serve something like a textbook where they can be the intermediaries between the mathematical ideas in their class. I can imagine MOOCs playing that kind of a role.
This is Jayati Debnath from Winona State University. I have to tell you, this is an enchanting experience to hear you. It's like a priest. You're preaching the lessons that we should all be carrying on. And I see this kind of thing happens in football, in martial art. They always do the basics for a long time before they actually get a lesson. And even in soccer, they go and then they kick. So, but my question is, so I really enjoyed what you said, but my question is, how can we teach our students to do this by themselves? With the video, and I have that experience also, I feel like I always have to be there. So what I try to do is making a student with another student, and I say, what question you should ask so that the other student, what is your experience about that? So not only I am doing this, I am also exponentially growing this idea among the students. So can you speak a little bit about that, or how to do that?
Let me point you to the wonderful presentation we saw at after lunch today by Julian Farron and Philip, where you saw the, where are they? Where they, I didn't see them. Oh, they're there. Right, where you saw the students by themselves. The teacher was not in the picture. Where the students were, questions were posed that encouraged the students to take a certain, that was the timer. Where by posing questions that allowed the students to do the exploration on their own, then they can make it their own. So the key is to pose the kind of challenges that encourage them and allow them to be successful at doing an exploration. So you tell them how to do it in the sense of saying you give them the questions that they have a good chance of solving, and then you give them the impulse. You say, okay, here's what you should do. You should explore it by looking at examples. You should look at simple cases. You should actually try some things. And if they get in those habits, then they can, you can pose harder and harder questions and then have them talk productively with each other. Yeah, the goal is for us to all become superfluous. I love those pictures where the teacher was not in the picture, because the teacher is not going to be in the picture after they graduate. And that's when we want them to be successful. I don't care how they are during college. I want them to be productive, clear-thinking citizens of the world after they're done. Wait, there's one more.
Last question.
Okay.
Hi, Eric Miles from University of Minnesota at Morris.
Yes.
If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's just starting out on their IBL journey, what would that be?
First of all, okay, try it. Try it. I guess that would be the one piece of advice. But the more expanded version is this. Get some clarity about what your goal is as an educator. And that goal should be to teach people to become independently able to think for themselves, to be creative, to be able to make decisions about the society in which we all live. The whole premise of particularly of democracy is that people are educated to make thoughtful decisions. You're educating people to be thoughtful citizens. And if you then ask yourself, what features does that mean? What do I want them to be able to have? You want them to understand things deeply. You want them to raise questions. You want them to be curious. You want them to be persistent. You want them to follow the flow of ideas. You want them to have these habits of mind that really make them productive and insightful citizens. And then ask yourself the question, what am I asking them to do in my day-to-day class that is actually fostering those skills? Am I doing things that will make them better communicators? Am I doing things that will make them better able to think for themselves? Am I doing things that let them make mistakes and learn from those mistakes? And then if you have that challenge in mind, then you'll make the decisions that will lead your students to have wonderful experiences in your classes.